I am delighted to present Jayati Ghosh, a brilliant economist, someone who's been a big influence on me. She taught economics at JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University in India for nearly 35 years. And in the past few years, she's been a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She has authored and or edited 20 books and more than 200 scholarly articles. And some of her recent books actually cover some of the topics that Radhika also covered from a different perspective in hers, including some of Jayati's most recent books, include The Making of a Catastrophe, COVID-19 and the Indian Economy, and also her book, When Governments Fail, COVID-19 and the Economy. She has received several prizes for her work and has advised governments in India and other countries, and was a member of the National Knowledge Commission of India. So Jayati, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you, Radhika, for inviting me to this fascinating discussion. Thank you also for producing such a thought-provoking book. And you can also tell it's thought-provoking with the really excellent comments we've already heard. I mean, Robert is always very illuminating, and I think many of his points were really interesting and well taken, and of course Victor's points as well. So I'm also going to look not at the medium term so much as the recent period, and take each of those three points in Radhika's title one by one, beginning with the coronavirus and specifically with the pandemic. And I think, I think there's a point at which you kind of suggest that COVID-19 is the end of the neoliberal era. I don't think that's true for the rest of the world. I think, yes, it certainly changed the attitudes of states in the rich countries, in the core of global capitalism. But for large parts of the rest of the world, I don't even want to call it them developing anymore, let's say the low and middle income countries, neoliberalism is alive, well, flourishing. And it has been, and it continues in these structures and the policies pushed by the international financial institutions upon these countries. It continues in the internalization of these ideas in these governments of these countries in terms of austerity, fiscal repression, tax policies that blatantly favor the wealthy and large corporations, the lack of any kind of attempts to produce public spending for social and economic rights, and all of those things. So neoliberalism, unfortunately, hasn't died for most of the world's population. It is temporarily, shall we say, taking a break in some of the rich countries, but I wouldn't say it's gone either. And what we're more likely to get, I'm afraid, in much of the, I suppose you could call it the decadent rich world, is a resurgence of a new kind of neoliberalism, which is combined with political populism, fascism, whatever you want to call it. We're already seeing the beginnings of that with Meloni in Italy. We're likely to see it quite soon in France if Marine Le Pen wins the next election, and who knows what will happen in the United States next year. So, these are not, these are phases that could very quickly change even in the rich world. I do also want to emphasize that the pandemic is not, in a sense, endogenous to the broader trajectory of capitalism, that we are going to see more and more public health disasters and pandemics. So yes, there was one particular thing. It's not just that the pandemic, the coronavirus episode is maybe partially over in much of the world, but there's now growing evidence that this was a reflection of a lab-based outbreak. I mean, it's quietly accepted by pretty much all the major public health people I have talked to, including in the US establishment, although it's not something that is broadcast. But increasingly, we're going to see pandemics that are driven by climate change. We're going to see health disasters resulting from the emergence of zoonotic diseases because climates have changed, because of major shifts in weather patterns, and the impacts on human and natural populations that have not developed immunity for those things. And these are going to get wider and worse. I think everybody accepts that, including in the WHO, including everywhere. I mean, people know that this is coming. The systems that would enable humanity to deal with it are not in place. And that reflects the broader geopolitics that Radhika talks about so well. The fact that, we are in a world of competing powers, and the obsession with that geopolitics, with that competing nationalisms, is much greater than any urge towards international cooperation. The second thing I'd like to talk about is the war. And particularly a lot of the, I don't think Radhika shares them, but the trouble is that there's so much media pushing the wrong line about the fact of the Ukraine war leading to global shortages of grain and so on and so forth, that it's really important to restate this once again. The Ukraine war did not lead to any decline in global supply of wheat. Zero. In fact, global production of wheat increased, global stocks increased, global trade, exports of wheat increased over the period of the peak of that war. That is to say, the period when wheat prices rose globally, from January to June 2022, which is really the massive peak in global wheat price rises. They go back to pre-war levels already by October to November 2022, right? So they go up massively and then they come down again to pre-war levels. But even in that period of massive price increase, there was no decline in global production of wheat, global trade of wheat, or global supplies of wheat, which includes the stocks. So what are we talking about? We are talking about a massive price increase, which was enabled by a lot of media discussion about how, oh yes, now there's this war and Ukraine and Russia are big wheat exporters, so there's going to be a price rise, which allows the public to accept price rises that are first driven by agribusinesses, all of which made historically unprecedented profits in this period, especially in the April to June quarter of 2022. And then allowed massive financial speculation to come back into commodity futures markets. So that, let's say in the Paris Wheat Exchange, 72% of open contracts were held by financial players. So clearly, this was not something that was driven by the war, nor was it driven by the Russian blockade on ports like Odessa in the Black Sea and so on. So all of that was media creation. And of course, let's say global leaders were complicit in this and actively propagated that particular line. But we should not be, shall we say, falling for that one ourselves. I do believe, however, that the war and its persistence and continuation is a reflection of, I forget who, I think it was possibly Branko Milanovic said that this is the victory of the owners of the means of mass destruction over the owners of means of production. It is the victory of the military-industrial complex in the US in particular, because it enables massively increased demand for their products. And it pushes a lot of these products also onto Europeans who had significantly decreased their defense spending. And it basically revives an industry that was otherwise, shall we say, not declining, but definitely stagnating. So the Ukraine war, if you're going to follow the money, the major beneficiaries are definitely the US military-industrial complex. And we have to recognize that. It's not necessarily a victory of US production capital or even production capital anywhere else. And that we have to therefore recognize the differences amongst capitals. There was a period when finance capital was a major beneficiary over, productivist capital. This is a period where we can talk about the armaments players being the major beneficiaries. The third thing I want to talk about is, if you like, the nature of geopolitics. And in that kind of touches on what I think Radhika is talking about, in this whole thing about capitalism. And I think her analysis of, let's call it decadent capitalism in the core is superb. It's absolutely spot on. You've got it, identified it completely. Does it follow that everybody else is socialist? There I disagree. I would not classify China as socialist. No, I'm sorry. Certainly not my vision of what socialism is. I would see it as a very, very successful state-led capitalist economy, which is successful also because of a remarkably efficient ability to discipline the capitalist class. China is able to discipline its domestic capitalists. There was a period when it was not doing so, and Xi Jinping has brought that back in a big way and is able to discipline them and mold both finance and large bourgeoisie towards the interests of the state and the economy. And yes, it is a productivist, spectacular success. There's no question about it. And I think both things are true. I think what Robert described in terms of the relative positions and what Victor described in terms of the trends, both are absolutely true. The relative position, still China well below, but China's rate of change is remarkable and I think historically unprecedented. And so yes, who knows, in a decade, 2 decades from now, it will, what will happen, and clearly it is on a much more upward trajectory. In that sense, I also agree with Victor that this technology war against China is really an own goal by the United States, which is unraveling very quickly. It's already unraveling, I think, as pointed out, the latest phone that is brought out, the new restrictions on Apple phones in China, all of these are going to hurt US much more than they will hurt China. And China has shown its ability to acquire and create its own technology very dramatically. Is that a victory for socialism? No. Is the emergence of all these new powers all over the world, is Saudi Arabia socialist? Is the UAE socialist? No. So let's not kid ourselves. This is geopolitics at a very advanced level. This is certainly a fight for global hegemony in different ways. Does it mean it's capitalism versus socialism? I personally do not think so. I believe that this is a newer, much more advanced form of attempts at geopolitical control, which also involve economic control in different ways, that the US has a longer history of really terrible attempts at domination and really disastrous impacts on war, on devastation, and so on. And China certainly does not. China to date has not invaded any other country. China has not, unleashed forces of mass destruction in the same way. And so there's no comparison between the two in that respect. But on the other hand, its relations with large parts of the developing world are not necessarily those of just, fraternal relations where you're all just working together and so on. They are much more driven by extractivist requirements, and they continue to be so. This leads me to my final and more sort of general point, which is that in all of this discussion, I think it's also all important for us to remember that whatever we see in terms of human and social progress should not be defined only in terms of production. I'm in a sense arguing against growthism or productivism as the indicator of human progress. I would say that, yes, it's amazing, this ability to increase GDP, to reduce income poverty, to diversify the economy, to shift the technological frontiers. Yes, they're all great. But I do believe that if we want to be thinking of ourselves as socialists, we have to be thinking of them in terms of expanding human freedoms. And in all ways, in terms of the Sen type capability, but also the old Marxian notions of human freedom, and those have to go beyond the purely productivist, and they have to take much more explicit account of the ecological constraints. So we need to create human societies that are obviously more equitable, more just, more humane, but also much more in harmony with nature and the planet. And so I guess, in a sense, what I'm responding to here is the idea that, there's this terrible decadent capitalist core, which I agree with, but that the alternative is this productivist, very efficient, very remarkable, very impressive Chinese state capitalism. I don't think these should be our only alternatives. Thanks.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on this screen.